So, I'm Ryder here, and heard on the news this morning that UVA canceled their Veterans Day memorial to avoid offending some students. There were two reasons put forth. One was that the memorial, which included a 21-gun salute, would perhaps frighten people, and two, that it might offend them by reminding them of the fact that guns are used in crimes. Now, I'm kind of scratching my head and saying, has the world lost its Goran mind? Which seems to be a common refrain nowadays, but in this case I think it's warranted. They've done a 21-gun salute on Veterans Day for years and years and years. If somebody's not going to realize that's what it is, or not realizing that it's Veterans Day, and instead is going to hear gunshots and assume that it must be a criminal attack, maybe they just need to pay more attention and remember what happened the previous year, and that it's Veterans Day, and that that's what they do on Veterans Day. Secondly, if they're worried about offending people by reminding them of the existence of firearms, those people are going to be perpetually offended, because firearms exist. They're a fact of life, and yes, sometimes they're used in crimes, but they're also something that plenty of people use for sporting purposes, for self-defense, that are just there in society, and is a perfectly normal thing. I think we've gotten to the point in this country where we've decided to take normal everyday things and demonize them, and it's making it difficult for normal everyday people to live their lives without fear of being infringed on by the rules proposed by the hysterical. But what it's also doing is, whether you're one of the people whose activities would be curtailed by those proposals or not, in this case, for example, gun control, what it's also creating is a culture of hysteria where people are frightened of everyday normal things, right? And I could see how that would serve an anti-gun agenda. I mean, if your goal is to get rid of firearms or severely restrict civilian firearm ownership, because you're not, let's face it, you're not going to get rid of firearms, period. But if your goal is to severely restrict civilian firearm ownership, then anything you can do that's going to demonize firearms and basically make people view them in the worst possible light no matter what, obviously is going to further that goal. So if you can convince people as a knee-jerk reaction whenever they even think of the idea of a gun to automatically assume the worst-case scenario, such as a criminal shooting, yes, that's going to further your political goals, but what is the cost to society, beyond obviously the cost of sacrificing the rights and interests and personal property of your fellow Americans who might, let's say, be shooters, be firearms enthusiasts? What you're also doing is creating a society where everybody is affected, whether they own a firearm or even like them or not, because what you're doing is you're creating a society where people are panicked by everyday normal things. And yes, firearm ownership is normal. It's a part of life. If you don't like that, okay, that's fine. But not liking a fact or disagreeing with it doesn't change that it is a fact. And if UVA was concerned that merely employing firearms in a salute, in a memorial on Veterans Day, was going to offend their students, then those students actually have a much bigger problem, because they're basically going to be offended by everything once they get out of the campus and into the real world, right? Because firearms, like I said, are a fact of life. They're present in reality, and so these people, maybe rather than say, let's stop doing an important memorial tradition that we've done for years, because it might offend some people who are newly inculcated with this anti-gun hysteria and are going to jump at shadows, maybe they should teach these people to grow a spine and not jump at shadows. Maybe they should teach them that you shouldn't. You're free to disagree with things, but you shouldn't be offended by something just because it exists. Not for nothing. Maybe that's what they should be doing instead. But rather than say, well, let's let's not encourage our students to be hysterical and jump at shadows. The response was, we're worried that they might become hysterical and jump at shadows, so we're going to cancel this salute. We're going to cancel this Veterans Day memorial because our students were worried they've been inculcated with anti-gun hysteria. And rather than address that, and obviously your students being inculcated with any kind of political hysteria is a potential problem for them in the rest of their lives. But rather than trying to address that and help them get over that hysteria and realize, that's not the way they should be living their lives, they've decided to pander to it. And I think that's awful. Right? I think that's awful. It's awful for the veterans and the celebration of Veterans Day that they decided to deny this memorial, to cancel this memorial in order to pander to a bunch of people who are jumping at shadows, or they're afraid they're going to jump at shadows. And it's going forward. How does that help those students? Right? If you're worried they're going to behave in an irrational manner because of an irrational fear, so you just go along with that irrational fear, does that help them in the long run, or anybody? No. But that's where we are now, right? Irrational fears have become policy. The world's lost its grand mind. Lone Rider out.